Welcome to the lecture Sustainable Stock Indices and Exchange Traded Funds. My name is Marco Menichetti and I will guide you through this lecture. The lecture is divided into two presentations. The first presentation is on sustainable indices. The second is on exchange traded funds. We will now directly start with the presentation on sustainable stock indices. For the part on sustainable exchange traded funds, I prepared a second presentation, which is independent and to which we will switch after having finished this presentation. Thus, the second presentation gets now eliminated and we concentrate us on sustainable stock indices. Let's move to the overview of this presentation. The table of contents shows you that the presentation on sustainable stock indices is divided into two parts. Part 1 will give us an overview onto indices and sustainable indices. We will talk about construction strategies and index differentiation of indices before we discuss index families and sustainable sub-indices. The part 2 of this presentation is on solely sustainable indices. After that, we will compare sustainable sub-indices and solely sustainable indices. In the next step, we will ask the question how sustainable a sustainable index can be. We will then present a short literature review before we close this part with a reference list. For starting with the section on indices and sustainable indices, I pass to the next slide. In order to start the topic indices, we need to clarify some questions. What is a stock index? Indices describe a specified basket of assets and measure their performance. Indices could replicate all or the most important assets of a country, a region, or the world. Instead of the entire market, indices could also track a specific industry or segment. Next question. Who is introducing the index to the public? Indices are constructed by companies having an interest in the existence of the index. Most indices have been constructed by companies belonging to the financial industry, like banks or exchanges, sometimes also by newspapers or other companies. What is the constructor responsible for? The constructor and the owner of an index determines the framework and the rules for the index constitution, and he regularly reviews the composition of the index. If necessary, the constitution rules can also be changed. What is the business model of an index constructor? Institutions using the index for their products have to pay license fees for the usage. Thus, the index owner tries to construct or develop indices which are highly demanded by financial market participants. Let us pass to the next slides where we discuss the types of indices. On this slide, the types of indices are explained. We have a very important differentiation into price index and performance index. The price index only tracks the underlying share prices. Dividends and other income are not included in the calculation, in the index calculation. On the other hand, the performance index depicts dividends in addition to share price as if dividends were immediately reinvested at no costs. Internationally, the price index is the more common index. Examples are the S&P 500, the Dow Jones Index, the Nasdaq, or the stocks index or indices. There are several. On the other hand, the DAX is an example for a performance index. We should also discuss the structure and content characteristics of indices. Important is the weighting of stocks in an index. That weighting could follow the difference in market capitalization, or the individual stock price, or all stocks could be equally weighted. Regarding the content, the index could be a broad market index, an industry index or sector index, or a strategy index. A strategy could be to invest in high dividend stocks or in qualitatively best valued stocks. The last item is a benchmark index. A benchmark index is an index used to evaluate a fund which has to be assessed. Now we are in a position to start the discussion of sustainable indices. Sustainable indices are based on sustainable criteria that vary among different index issuers, and they track stocks of companies that are economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. The first sustainable index was offered by Dow Jones in collaboration with Robeco Sam in 1999, since governments started rewarding companies with sustainable practices. Sustainable indices often serve as a benchmark for investors who are interested in including sustainable considerations in their portfolio. With this slide, we finish the first section on indices and sustainable indices, and we move back to our table of contents. And as you see, we now pass to the next section, which is construction strategies and index differentiation. Construction strategies and index differentiation is a longer section with 5 slides. We start with a discussion of strategies used to construct a sustainable index. At the beginning, we assume that a conventional parent index is existing, like the Dow Jones World Index or like the MSCI World. And a sustainable one should be constructed, which would be then the Dow Jones Sustainable Index World as an example. One approach would be to create the sustainable index by selecting the most sustainable stocks from the conventional index. As an example, by screening, by theme investing, by impact generation, and so on. The second approach would be to re-weight the assets in the portfolio based on sustainability criteria. And the last approach is a hybrid one. That means a combination of selection and re-weighting. Another approach would be to divide indices into ESG-related and carbon-related indices. It should be mentioned that the current sustainable index landscape is very heterogeneous because the level of sustainability offered by indices is very different and not transparent. For the future, sustainable indices should aim to incorporate sustainability more transparently into investment tools. On the next slide, we describe how sustainable sub-indices for MSCI World have been constructed. As we see, MSCI choose the differentiation into ESG-related indices and carbon-related indices. As you see regarding ESG-related indices, they created a World ESG Leaders, a World SRI Index, a World ESG Universal Index, and a World ESG Focus. And regarding carbon-related indices, you see they generated a World X Coal, a World X Fossil Fuels, a World Low Carbon Target, and a World Low Carbon Leaders. This is just an example. You may find that also for other big families, index families. The next two pages offer index objectives and construction criteria for those indices, all based on the MSCI World Index. The table on slide 9 and then followed by 10 shows a construction framework for describing the indices based on specific criteria. In the first column, you will find the different indices, and in the following 5 columns, you find the criteria which are objective, exclusion of business activities, exclusion based on controversies, selection or weighting based on ESG criteria, and finally, an optimization approach. This table gives you a good insight on differentiation possibilities for a specific group of sustainable investors. I don't want to go together with you through the entire table on slide 9 and 10 and leave it to your personal reading. We then come to slide 11. On slide 11 we discuss the different broadness of indices. You see here that there is a differentiation in 2 broad-based indices, sector-specific indices and composite indices. A broad-based index means that companies from all sectors are included. To become listed in the sustainable index, the companies have to implement ESG or other sustainable development criteria into their business strategies. A good example is the Wiener Börse VÖNIX Sustainability Index or the FTSE for Good Index. Sector-specific indices include only corporations that are active in the same industry and address the same development problems. For instance, green energy production. Examples for such indices are Deutsche Börse's DAX Global Alternative Energy Index or the FTSE's Environmental Technology Index. After broad-based and sector-specific indices, we also must mention composite indices, which are a combination of the first two. For example, the New York Stock Exchange Euronext Low Carbon 100 Europe. This index is not sector-specific and only addresses one of the 3 ESG dimensions. The understanding of composite is not that clear. I just want to make you sensible for that point. Sometimes the term composite expresses the fact that the index basket is formed by all listed stocks of an exchange. Here one example is the composite DAX, we call it also CDAX, which inhibits all listed stocks of the Deutsche Börse. Yeah, our next section according to the table of contents is now conventional index families and their sustainable sub-indices. We now discuss the differentiation into sub-indices of well-known index families on one hand and on the other hand, indices not connected with the big indices, with the big existing index market players. We call the second type of indices solely sustainable indices. The differentiation into those two types is theoretically important, as this will lead to an important different approach in selecting the basket companies, and both types will now be discussed. With index families, we understand large index providers, not offering only one blue chip index, but a variety of additional indices like sector indices, small and medium company indices, strategy indices, and so on. And of course, they also started to construct sustainable indices in order to increase their revenues. Examples for index families are stocks, the stocks family, Dow Jones, S&P, MSCI, FTSE or DAX, and there are many more. In the meantime, they all offer sustainable sub-indices additionally to traditional indices. They developed different approaches and use different criteria to integrate knowledge on sustainability. Third parties are often involved in the sustainable index construction. Those companies are specialized on the delivery of sustainable information which they receive from data collection and their individual methodology designed by their own. If you move to the next slide, you will see some more index brands and sustainable specialists. So you see here an overview, but these are just examples. On slide 15, we start with a short presentation of a selection of big family indices, all having started their sustainable sub-indices. On slide 15 here, you will find Dow Jones Sustainability Indices. On the following slide, the MSCI Sustainable Indices, then followed by FTSE Russell, and finally on slide 18, the Stocks Europe Sustainable Indices. Please read the information given by your own. That's the FTSE Russell, the Stocks Europe Sustainability Index. And we came now to the end of the first part on sustainable stock indices. My advice is to switch immediately over to the second part of the presentation. So I hope I see you soon.